Hey everyone, welcome to this week's edition of Getting In, a College Coach Conversation. My name's Ian Fisher. I'm your host again this week. I was here last week. For those of you who are really concerned, don't worry. Beth will be back next week in the hosting chair, so you can look forward to all of her expertise. But we've got a really great show for you today, so don't just fast forward to the next episode and wait for next week. We've got a lot of good content to uncover for today. We are discussing in our second segment the essays for the University of Southern California, a little bit of a broader set of essay prompts, I think, than most people expect. So if you're looking at all at USC, you'll want to stick around for that in the second part of the show. We're also going to talk a little bit about how to get involved in some of the financial aid processes that are required at this point if you haven't done anything yet. And that bridges pretty well into what we're talking about here with our first segment today. I got to welcome my colleague Ryan Kelley to the show. Hey, Ryan, how you doing?
Good. How are you?
I'm doing well. It's good to have you here. And we are talking about, it's right now, November 3rd. We're going to be airing this on November 11th. I am currently being fueled by caffeine and Halloween candy. I don't know if you're in the same position that I am, but we've passed this we've passed this major milestone in the college application process. And I think for those who are not savvy, they might think, well, November 1st has passed. I missed an opportunity to apply. We want to talk today about a lot of students that maybe are just getting started right now or missed that 11-1 window and are looking ahead to college applications. Can you just help, for those who are maybe unfamiliar, why is November 1st such a big deal in the application process? And why is there so much conversation around that particular day?
Sure. So you are correct. I mean, schools around the country have different deadlines, but the first big one seems to be November 1st, and it's dominated by what's referred to as early action and early decision. Sometimes those are available on the same day at the same school, but that gets a lot of press and is a source of anxiety, and a lot of highly motivated students are applying early, and that can often dominate the first part of kids. I have to apply by early action or early decision, and that's oftentimes November 1st. But what oftentimes is neglected to be realized is it's not usually the only deadline that's available at a school, and oftentimes students, for one reason or another, are late to the game for applying. And then some kids who get to the game a little bit late think, well, shoot, I missed November 1. Now what? And that can be very overwhelming on top of what is already oftentimes an overwhelming and mystifying process for kids.
Right. Which is why we're here every week to talk about it, because it is overwhelming and mystifying. And I think, Ryan, there are a lot of reasons that November 1st deadline can be challenging for students. It might be that they are just not plugged into or aware of those deadlines. I think if you're a listener on this show, you probably are aware to some extent. But November 1st, I think, crept up on a lot of kids this year, partly because of the return to school after the pandemic, a lot of the associated difficulties with reacclimating to the classroom, and then all of the expectations that are foisted on students when it comes time to apply to these colleges. And so while November 1st is an important deadline, and we certainly talk about it a lot here at College Coach, with the exception of the University of Florida, which I think is in Florida State as well, I think they're the only schools that I know of where if you have not applied by November 1st, you're out of luck. Everywhere else has another deadline coming. And so there is still time to submit an application for these schools. Now, Ryan, we were talking before, I was saying probably our listeners are on top of things and their applications are already signed and sealed. And they're just looking for extra little tips that they can come for the show, but they might have some cousins or family friends who have not gotten started with the process. What is your advice for a student who, let's say you have a conversation with them this week and they say, I really haven't done anything yet. I've got an idea about a couple of schools I might be interested in, but we thought that this happened in the winter, and so we haven't really started. What's your first move as a counselor?
That's actually not a hypothetical situation. I've actually had that conversation this week.
Okay, there you go.
And that's okay to think it happens in the winter, because sometimes it does happen in the winter. There are schools that have deadlines of December 1st or January 15th or whatever it happens to be. And what I say is it's not too late. However, right now is really your time to ramp up the process a little bit
Yeah.
in looking for schools. Maybe if you're at that point already, looking at the requirements for, number of recommendations or whatever it is that the school happens to be looking for, and actively starting to be engaged in the process, asking for letters of recommendation, working with your high school guidance department to make sure that transcripts are getting sent in a timely fashion, not to mention working on the actual application, the essays, all the things that are now within your control. Because yes, the big November 1 deadline has come and gone, but it's now your opportunity to really step up and start working on the search process and the application creation process. Because with the exception of a handful of schools, it's not too late. However, those deadlines, whatever they happen to be, everyone knows, November 1st got here pretty fast. December 1 or January 1 or whatever it is, it'll be here pretty fast.
It's coming quickly as well. I was trying to talk to some of my students about this last week, and they were getting pretty close to deciding whether they wanted to submit in advance of November 1st or take a little bit more time to look for that regular deadline, just in terms of the quality of the work that they were putting together. And I said, well, one thing that you can't do is wait until November 2nd and just say, well, I got a whole month now. I'm going to just sit back and I got plenty of time, because it will creep up on you just like November 1st did. So if you are in that boat where you have been putting things off and for whatever reason missed that November 1 deadline, now is time to create an action plan where you're really chipping away at this process every single day, doing something to support the work that needs to be done here. Ryan, you mentioned letters of recommendation, and obviously high schools play a huge role in supporting students in their college application process. For a student, it feels like this is a little bit of a hat in hand moment if you're going to a teacher or a counselor now to initiate that college application process. What advice would you give for a student who has not yet asked a teacher for a letter of recommendation? How can I make that work for me as a senior?
Yeah, I like that, hat in hand. I don't know if you necessarily need to grovel at this point, but
maybe a little bit of groveling would be okay.
The longer you wait, the more groveling will ensue. But reaching out to your counselors or to your teachers or whomever it is that you're going to be asking for recommendations and saying, kind of owning it a little bit. I'm a little late to this process. I understand that. And I understand you probably have written most of your recommendations at this point, but I was wondering if you'd be willing to write one more on my behalf. I don't think the teacher, unless they have some fairly rigorous, hard and fast deadline that they stick to, which is some do, but pretty rare. I think they're usually accommodating, saying, I'm a little bit late, but would you be willing to make an extra recommendation on my behalf? If you are a little humble in that process, they're probably a lot more willing to work with you. They're probably very willing to work with you in the first place, but acknowledging I'm late, could use an extra hand, might make them a little bit more willing to assist.
And I think before going and making that request, do a little bit of your own homework, right?
Absolutely.
Figure out what the deadlines are that are coming up. I can just imagine a situation where you go and say, I know I'm late. Can you please write a letter of recommendation? The teacher says, okay, where are you applying and what are the deadlines? And you say, well, I haven't totally figured that out yet, and I'm not sure. It's like, that's no, we don't want that scenario, right? So do some of the advanced work to put yourself in a position so that when the teacher does ask that question, you can say, here's where I'm applying, here's what the deadlines are, and is there anything else you need from me to help to facilitate this? I think students very rarely ask teachers what they can do for them when they're asking for a letter on their behalf. So, take that opportunity. All right. So the key difference between early action and regular decision is essentially when you are notified. There's not a really meaningful difference in terms of the likelihood of your outcome. But when we talk about early decision, and you alluded to that earlier, there is sometimes an admission advantage to applying ED1 to a school. What about this ED2 deadline? Let's say I've got a first choice college and I have missed that ED deadline, or I wasn't aware of it for whatever reason. How does ED2 fit into the process, and how can I think about that?
Sure. It's a pretty rare opportunity for ED2. Relatively speaking, it's not offered at a tremendous number of schools, but it is a second opportunity for a student to really highlight that this school is, in fact, my number one choice. For whatever reason, I wasn't able to meet ED1, or maybe another school was my actual choice. I didn't get in, or I delayed it, but for whatever reason, this school now is clearly my first choice. And I'd like to indicate that in the admissions process. So
Yeah.
ED2 could be as, in the December, beginning January type of time frame, really depends on the institution. But it's a way for the student to produce a second or an application that's strong. They have a little bit more time, and indicate that, I may not have applied ED1, but please understand that you are clearly my first choice now. And I want that to be conveyed in the application and in the review process. So
Yeah.
it's never too late to, if assuming they have an ED2 option, it's never too late until it is too late. But you really want to be working on those applications and strengthening them to the best of your ability to make sure you're putting your best face forward, regardless of ED or regular.
A lot of families will ask, all right, I missed ED1, now I've got ED2, but is that the same? Is that the same advantage? Are ED1 students preferred to ED2 students? How can we think about that differentiation? Is there any difference between the two?
My experience has been no, that they're not vastly different. They're still looking for the same type of student. It's just in the review process, there's that indication that we are your first choice, and that can be advantageous in the review process. Every school does it a little bit differently. So yeah.
We at Reed had ED1 and ED2, and what we found was that the ED2 pool, first of all, was just quite a bit smaller than ED1, but we were essentially looking for the same kinds of things. I think the only scenario where ED2 would be a disadvantage relative to ED1, and this is kind of beside the point because you've already missed the ED1 deadline, so it doesn't really matter in that case, but the reason ED2 could be a disadvantage is if there's a huge number of ED1 applicants who are accepted, and the school has an embarrassment of riches, and so they're going to look to RD for most of the rest of their class. I think that's pretty uncommon. And I love what you said, Ryan, about a school being your first choice. A lot of people might say, well, how can that make sense? It's ED2. Sure. But if you are entering into that binding agreement with ED2, you are saying, I will come if I'm, if I'm admitted. And so there is that same sense of, this is my first choice. I am committed to you. So it has that same effect with colleges. Now, I'm just sort of curious about some of the other different forms of deadlines. We've talked about early action, and every school that offers early action has a regular decision, and the same thing with ED schools having regular decision. What are some other kind of deadlines that we might be looking for that we haven't talked about so far and that are still available for students, but that they might want to be aware of if they're just getting started now?
Yeah, so the big ones are what I would refer to as rolling admissions. And then, so first, rolling admissions is essentially you can apply at any point and you get back a decision, 2, 3, 4 weeks later, whatever it happens to be. And the school will accept your application as long as they're accepting applications and the class isn't full. And that can be today, that can be in March or April or June. It really depends on the institution. However, a lot of those schools and many other schools have what are referred to as priority deadlines. So there might be early action, regular decision, but a priority deadline somewhere in the middle, or even a priority deadline for rolling admissions, where in order to be considered fully for scholarships, for specific academic programs like an honors college or whatever it is, you have to apply by a specific date, which is referred to as a priority deadline. Those students literally get the priority, and then they will consider any student after that space available or whatever their process happens to look like. So a lot of students will say, I have until January 15th to apply, and that might be true for their deadline, but if you want to be considered for a scholarship or the honors program or something altogether different, you had to apply by whatever it was, January 1st. So keeping that organized and not even in the back of your mind, but at the forefront of your mind of, yes, I have different deadlines, but some might be more important than others.
Yeah, and I've seen this with, I think the University of Arizona has something like a May 3rd final deadline. And a lot of students might look at that and say, I got plenty of time to apply to U of A. But I also know students who have gotten into U of A already because it is a rolling admission process. Right. And wouldn't you rather hear back from a school in 2 weeks from now than having to wait until April or May to hear back from that school? Yes. The answer is yes, because you want more information to be able to make your decisions as you go forward. We have, Ryan, you had told me in advance of this. Of course, there are some regular decision deadlines that are still coming up. A lot of students are still looking at the University of California system. A lot of major public universities still have their regular decision deadlines coming up. It's November 11th when families are listening to this, and the University of Washington's final deadline is coming up in 4 days on the 15th. Just any final tips that you have around students who are just starting on their essays right now? How much time do they need to really commit to an essay in order to get it to a position where it is submittable? Are we talking one night and then submit it in the morning? What should students account for in terms of their planning period?
I would not recommend one night and then submit.
Okay. Neither would I.
I mean, I guess you could. It wouldn't be the strategy I would recommend. It depends on the student, depends on the quality of their ability to write. Yeah. But I always like to write, review, sit and think, and come back to it with a fresh set of eyes. And that can take a day or two or a week or two. Mm-hmm. The more time you have to devote to it, the more polishing of it you can create for it. Leaving it to the last minute. I know a lot of folks say I work best under pressure. I don't like that approach.
Don't say that.
Yeah. It is not a good approach. So if you have a deadline coming up in 2 weeks, I would say start writing your essay now, get it revised, have, a friend or parent or teacher or someone look at it, give you some feedback and digest what that feedback is, and then look at it with a new set of eyes a couple days later or what have you. But the more revisions you can devote to it, the more time, usually the stronger it will end up being. So please don't procrastinate on that.
I was also thinking 2 weeks. I think that that's a really great time frame for people to think about. And of course, there are going to be essay supplements. So if you finish a personal essay in 2 weeks, you're probably going to have to tackle some other stuff. Sure. I just want to pick up on one other thing that you said, which is asking someone to have a look at that. But that is a singular someone. And I think at this phase, it is perhaps even worse than normal to go and ask 4 different people for their perspective on your essay. You might think that that's going to provide you a lot of support, but it's going to pull your writing in 4 different directions. Absolutely. So figure out, who do I want to ask? Who is the person that's going to contribute the most value to my essay at this phase in the process? And I'm going to use that person as my resource. Outside of that, I'm really going to trust myself and make sure that that message resonates in terms of what I'm trying to say.
100%.
All right. Well, I think that's great, Ryan. Like there are a lot of really good things for students to think about, even at this late phase in the process. It is definitely not too late to apply to college, right? So thank you so much for those tips. I really appreciate you coming on and sharing them with us.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, try and stay off the Halloween candy though. Okay. Like you and I, dads, like we got to be really careful. My son thought he had hidden it well, but like it was so obvious where it was. These kids are... He's 7. He doesn't know better. All right. Yeah. When we come back, we will be talking about the USC essays. Don't go away.